the Forbes articles on light. Yesterday, I had shared some of the rationale and genesis of these two articles, and we had dived into the first three of the maxims, the light maxims that appear in the first article, a radical driver of change for radical times. And essentially, if we just step back and ask, why is this article called a radical driver of change for radical times, then essentially the radical times really is looking at the complexity of the environment that we're in and the rapid change that we've been going through and the unprecedented change for many of us that's been occurring in 2020, and it looks like it's going to continue for quite a while. But this is what we should expect from a living complex adaptive system, because if we really ask, what is a complex adaptive system, we know that it's comprised of a number of heterogeneous units that are independent, that are considered to be autonomous. There's no centralized control. There is a high degree of interaction between these different units, and therefore there is a high degree of unpredictability. There is uncertainty. There's a lot of paradox. Small changes can make huge, big effects take place with some time lag. We have properties of emergence, where we simply cannot predict how the interaction of different components is going to create a foundation for something else entirely different to emerge. And the easiest way for me to think about this, given that complex adaptive systems are not just something that happens in the human organizational space, but is something that has been occurring for eons, is to think about, for example, a reality of, say, quantum particles. And it's impossible to predict that atoms would emerge from that, yet that's what emerges. And then when you look at the reality of atoms, it's impossible to predict that you're going to have molecules and molecular plans. And then it's impossible to predict on that foundation that there's going to be these living cells, and so on and so forth. So the point being that when we look out at any complex adaptive system, then there's this phenomena called emergence, which by definition is you can't see it if you're looking at things from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. And even if you're looking at things from the top down, sometimes these kind of emergences are entirely of a different and new nature. But that's the nature of the complex adaptive system. That's the nature of the radical times that we're perhaps stepping into, where it's extremely difficult, given all the trajectories that are visible right now, to predict what might happen as a result of these. So the question is, how do you manage in such an environment? And therefore, it was a radical driver of change for radical times, and a radical driver of change being here, the application of light. But if we step back and look at the trajectory of alternative approaches to managing change, we can see that for a few decades, there's been this drift, or rather this trend, to employ something very different from what we would consider vehicles to make business change. So, for example, I'm referring to things like mindfulness and emotional intelligence. And if we think about mindfulness, this is the act of becoming present in the now, of becoming aware of what's going on within us, around us. And the significance of something like this becomes much more important when we consider that a complex adaptive system has a fractal reality to it. So what do I mean by that? I mean that very often it's the small changes, it's perceptions, it's assumptions that people have or a group of people have, something that's seemingly small that's happening in your own mind space that can have huge ripples and huge effects on how organizations work, on how markets work, on how different civilizations are perceived. And so it's these small things that have huge effects. And so, therefore, a phenomena or therefore an approach or a vehicle to change like mindfulness becomes extremely important in that kind of scenario, because I could make the case that, certainly from a scientific point of view, we have like the phenomena of, let's just think about climate change for a minute. So climate change is the result of an increase in, we can say, carbon dioxide in the environment that creates a greenhouse effect that just warms up the temperature across the globe. But the point being is that when we look at the number of micro acts that have created this macro phenomenon, we can in fact see that it is nothing but a number of micro acts. So it's the continual decisions, it's the continual reinforcement of a particular kind of consumerism that drives, for example, industrial action and industrial output, and short termism, where we won't think about the effects of what we're doing right now or our need to fulfill small things right now. We simply don't equate it to how in 30 years it might change everything globally. But there's certainly an argument to be made that climate change is a result of millions of micro actions taken by people around the world who are embracing consumerism, perhaps in a blind fashion. Point being is that there's this fractal reality that by which small things make huge impacts, and therefore a vehicle or something like mindfulness that makes us aware of these micro acts, when practiced on a larger scale, can have an impact, certainly, again, with a time lag. So something like mindfulness becomes very important as perhaps an approach to make long-term change. And mindfulness, if we look at it, it's the phenomenon of mindfulness in the corporate sector perhaps rose about, I would say, 2 decades ago, and it's been embraced by some of the largest organizations today. And even if we look at emotional intelligence, that's something that's newer, but is as far-reaching in its effects, because when we think about mindfulness, it's something that each of us is going to embrace and practice a little differently. We're going to make decisions a little differently by becoming aware of what's driving us. And in a sense, that's mindfulness. It's practice in our own space. It's practice through an awareness at the individual level. When we think about emotional intelligence, it spreads in a different kind of way, because here, by definition, our emotions are something that are much more, in a sense, I'm going to use the word visceral. They're more tangible. They impact the environment, the immediate work environment, much more quickly. And therefore, if somebody is feeling anger, then the results of that anger, if unchecked, could create a spiral, and there could be decisions made by the group of people around that emanation of anger, or an organization in which anger is unchecked, that would become much more significant much more quickly. There's kind of an urgency in emotion that perhaps doesn't exist when we're just aware, or trying to become aware of our mind space, as in mindfulness. So emotional intelligence has a different kind of play, and yet now, if we look at the last 10 years or so, that's something that has become much more mainstream as a technique to bring about more sustainable change. And it's important because the first kind of step in emotional intelligence is where we become aware of what's going on within us on the emotional front, and then we the second step is something that I would call self motivation, where you don't require an external force to motivate you, but you can motivate yourself by shifting, say, or by creating a state of joy or of drive or of passion. So you can create the emotional state that's going to drive you to do something different. And so there's this phenomena of self-motivation, which is another level of emotional intelligence. And then similarly, it trickles out, or it kind of expands even further in fractal fashion, because when we are aware of what's going on in ourselves emotionally, then we can also become aware of what others are experiencing, and therefore we also have the power to help to change that, and so on. So the point being is that there's already a trajectory in place of alternative approaches to address these complex organizational problems. It started with mindfulness. It's the last couple of decades has been emotional intelligence has arisen quite a bit, and so with that backdrop, when I propose that the application of light has perhaps become more timely now, it's against this trend that's already been in place for a few decades. And the difference being, so for example, as I've already suggested, light is by definition ubiquitous. Anything that exists, whether it's animate or inanimate, has a deep signature of light inside it. And therefore, light is much more accessible. It's in our cells, it's in our atoms. If we focus on our hands and if we use our mind's eye to try and penetrate into our hands, we can imagine or visualize that it's connected intimately with light. And that imagination itself, I'm proposing, connects us to the reality of light in a way that perhaps we don't think is possible unless we start doing it more and more. So we're building that muscle of beginning to exercise seeing in light, if you will. But light, by definition, since it's ubiquitous, it and everything is, as I suggested also yesterday, it locks us into, or it grounds us in this massive light-based operating system through the action of millions and millions of photons. Therefore, we can really perceive, or we can think of light as being kind of this ubiquitous fabric that connects everything. And if I step back and think about the cosmology of light framework, then this light exists on another layer of light, and that exists on another layer of light. And these layers of light, these deeper layers of light, operate differently. And I've suggested in previous live streams the reason why these operate differently is because if we want to think about it from a quote unquote scientific lens, then certainly the way light operates in this physical realm is tied to a large degree to the speed with which it travels, which is a constant 186,000 miles per second. But then if there's a deeper layer of light that exists just behind this outer physical layer of light, I'm proposing that has a different dynamic and a different speed that is beyond our speed of c that we know physical light exists at, quote unquote physical light exists at. And then there's a different set of dynamics that are hinged onto that layer of light. And then as we go deeper and deeper into a conceptual space where light travels infinitely fast, where the reality is entirely different. Point being that when we begin to perceive in light, if we begin to connect to this ubiquitous phenomena that animates us, by which we exist, by which we are grounded in this massive light-based operating system, then we already have a point of entry into this multi-layered reality of light. And when I suggest that the visualization of light actually changes information fields, that's not just a metaphor or a fanciful way of trying to get attention, but it's based on this notion of arbitration of possibility that's bubbling up or surfacing from these multiple layers of light, where light travels at different speeds and therefore holds different kinds of information in it. So when we visualize in light, we are in a sense changing the persistent quantum level computation, where quanta can be thought of as a bridge mechanism between one layer of light and another, or the layer of light that's just a little deeper than this physical layer and the layer that exists just behind it. And so there's a different dynamic that's put into effect as a result of seeing in light, visualizing in light, that operates differently than emotional intelligence or mindfulness. So if we think about this trajectory, mindfulness, as I suggested, is something that predominantly it's an individual phenomenon, and through becoming aware of what's going on within us, we can change more rapidly certain habits that we have. But these will happen primarily or predominantly at an individual level. When we think about emotional intelligence, then already the field of application has spread, because emotions are something that are more viscerally connect us with everything around us. And even I would say that this sophisticated radar system that we have in us of emotions is a way by which we get very relevant data about what's happening around us, because it creates a certain response within us. And this response is not of the kind that exists in ideas in the mind, but it's something much more visceral that we feel, and that can motivate us to action much more quickly. But the point being is that when we look at trajectory, then as compared to mindfulness, emotional intelligence is further spread out, it's more visceral, it connects in a different and more immediate way. And I want to propose that following this trajectory, light itself is something that is has a much larger field of application, because it's fundamentally ubiquitous. It fundamentally makes up everything that we are. So so if we begin to tap into this ever-present light that exists in the smallest speck, both within us and without us, then already there's a different kind of action that is possible. And when we think about the layers of light kind of stacked on each other, then also we perhaps can get insight into how this persistent computation that from which things surface up in the moment can be changed due to just leveraging, if you will, the dynamic of light that's ever present. But so um, that was, as we kind of transition into the next three maxims, I think just keeping that in mind is really important. And if I just review really quickly the first three maxims, it's learn to perceive light differently, and light, as I've just said again, is fundamentally different. It's ubiquitous. It exists within and without us, and it's in a cosmology of light framework. It's certainly multidimensional. It's layered. There's not just physical light, but there's more and more subtle light that, if we tap into light, then the nature of light being one, we can theoretically access different kinds of dynamics that are anchored on more subtle layers of light, and therefore action also can become different. So we learn to perceive light differently. Fluency in light dynamics is a muscle that needs strengthening, and just like mindfulness, just like emotional intelligence, or anything that we want to do that's different, if we don't do it enough, it's never going to become something that we can do with any kind of mastery. And then the third maxim that we looked at yesterday was create a light sphere to help facilitate change. And this, in fact, this notion of creating a light sphere goes back to a individual experience that I had, and that became real for me. But the fact is that it's also perhaps a meditative technique that exists in many, many different parts of the world is visualization of light, seeing things inside light, allowing light to act on situations by imagining a sun within or without that situation. And so the light sphere helps to facilitate change. Now, as we transition into the remaining three maxims, which hopefully I've set up through the trend that's occurring, there's two trends that I've kind of referred to. One is the trend of the application of alternative approaches to manage complex change, starting from mindfulness to emotional intelligence to the application of light. And the second is the radical times um, trend, where, in a sense, things may have been simpler if we go back a few decades, localized. It's easy to create a relatively simple theory on how to manage situations in these isolated kind of instances. And perhaps that's what we get exposed to a lot if we go to business school or in the frameworks that we study in organizations. But the point is that now, if you look at reality, and a lot of this due to the fractal phenomena, is that system has morphed and changed so much and has a trajectory in its own development. And today we're seeing the results of that, with the massive kind of efforts that really do require a coordinated global response and are challenging us to step out of our smallness on many different scales. So, our own kind of individual selfishness, or the way that we want to run things in organizations um, that had its time and place. But I think in today's world, as we kind of we're on this cusp, and as we move into something that perhaps will emerge in this post-COVID reality, it's going to be more of where this global coordinated effort is required, and that the kind of technique that goes hand in hand with that is, in a sense, this application of light as an approach to make change happen. So if you look at the fourth maxim, it's any person, situation, or condition can be invited into one light sphere and be re-seen in light. And again, that's challenging us to change our processing, to not get stuck in habitual habits of, if there's somebody who creates a negative response in us, just naturally, when we see that person, we may go into a particular kind of programming. But instead, if we kind of intervene with the idea of creating a light sphere and seeing that person in the light sphere that we've generated, then I want to suggest that the way that we approach that situation is going to change. And very, very, for I'll give you a simple example, but if we pause and if we generate this light sphere within us, and if we make it grow, then it's going to change our hormonal activity. And then as a result of that, the kinds of information that we attribute to a situation is going to be different than in the absence. So suppose we had a program like, or an emotion like anger or fear running, then we're going to attribute different kind of information to that same situation. If we have a light program running, so that we're processing everything in light, then we're going to attribute different information to that same situation. And so, even from this very simple um, change in the information field, we can see that things might be different. And so, just the practice of seeing different, even formidable situations inside a light sphere, I want to propose, can make a difference to how it's managed and how it might evolve, not only because of any kind of intrinsic hormonal activity or information that we attribute, but then also simply because light is ubiquitous. And when we connect with light, we are, I believe, connecting to this multi-layered, multi-dimensional reality of light from which everything emerges, and therefore the quantum computation that in a sense determines reality at every new point in time is altered, and something different can arise as a result. So this really gets us into this fifth point. Light has its own logic and can change the information field of anything in one's light sphere. And again, from a cosmology of light point of view, this is simply because of the multidimensionality of the stacked layers of light, and the fact that quantum phenomena arises from one layer of light to another. And quantum is a bridge where more subtle information becomes more material in its process of surfacing up into material form, basically. And then this sixth maxim is the power to positively influence change is limited only by the individual. And this is really a call to power, because in this point of view, change doesn't depend on somebody else. It doesn't depend on circumstances changing and us waiting for them to change. The actor of change is us right here, right now. And if we can step into that power that we all have by virtue of all being anchorings in one large light based operating system, in a manner of speaking, then things can change more rapidly and more quickly. But again, we've got to step out of this usual programming of fear and anger and our habitual thoughts and seeing things in a small way or in a selfish way. And the practice of seeing in light, in feeling light, helps us to make that change. So, these become the six maxims. And yesterday I also mentioned this Forbes Organizational Sciences certification course. And I want to spend a few minutes to just speak about that, because there were three pillars that really were the basis of this course that I had suggested was done in partnership with Forbes. And there were 100 executives from 150 companies that signed up for it. And the very first pillar, or the first focus area, was complex adaptive systems as a whole. And the idea of just beginning to think about our system and our organization's place in the system in a different way, as belonging to one cohesive system, which we have to think about differently. And then the second pillar was emotional intelligence, because emotional intelligence is a solid concrete step where we become aware of many of the more forceful actions and reactions, or rather reactions, that are just implicit in the way we meet circumstance, that cut us off from really what's happening, because we're not really in touch with something when we've got an emotion program running. But when we become aware that there's an emotional program running, and when we can step out of that, then we can connect with what's happening outside. So in this complex adaptive system that's massive, that's large, that has its own trajectory, where there's fractal effects that are put in effect 20, 30 years later and are now playing out, we need approaches to begin to see clearly. And this emotional intelligence is one such approach to begin to get more in touch with what's really happening by stopping what's not happening, in the sense that so long as we're running a program which seizes us, which encases us, then we really don't know what's happening. We just think we know what's happening, but it's just a interpretation of our view of the situation. And so hopefully a practice like emotional intelligence begins to help us see more clearly. And so the second pillar was around that, and essentially it was also focused on helping teams become more mature. And the third pillar was, as I mentioned, around light, where I introduced these six maxims of light. Now, I'll say also, just in retrospect, and as kind of like a few concluding comments that it's clear that if I think about that Forbes Organizational Sciences Certification Program, it's clear that the the mindset and the relative ease with which executives from these diversity of companies locked into the idea and the concept of complex adaptive systems was expectedly easeful. I mean, it happened very easily, and there was a lot of interest in it, and that's natural. When we go to business school, or when we think about complex change in systems, many of us are always trying to understand complex environments in a different way, and so any framework that helps us to see that is going to be attractive, and so naturally there was an attractiveness amongst this group of people who participated in that certification program. When we moved to the second pillar, which was emotional intelligence, now I would say that from 150 execs in the first one, it dropped to about 120, which is still not bad. It was pretty good. I never even expected that. But the point being is that there was already a natural drop off because it's not perhaps considered mainstream, or the connection on how it's going to impact business hasn't been adequately made. And so that was the whole point of the certification program, that we've got to step out of this current paradigm of thinking and begin to think about organizations and the impact of organizations and how to design organizations in a different way altogether. And then when we reached the third pillar, then it dropped from about 120 to roughly around 90 people, 90 execs, from execs from 90 different companies, which again was higher than I expected, but it also is, I think, natural, given that light is something that hasn't been discussed, hasn't been used, hasn't been corporatized yet. And as far as I know, the 70 or so workshops that I had in the last 1 year was perhaps the most coordinated effort to try and introduce light in the corporate space. But I think that just given the nature of change that is going to be happening, and the fact that light itself has already proven itself technologically and scientifically, there needs to be more advances. That there will be more and more of an opening to what light represents, and it's not just physical light, but there is subtle layers of light that are all part of light because the nature of light is one.